The Griffin estate rose from the soil like a wound that never healed. A vast house of weathered stone and blackened timber standing on the outskirts of rural Massachusetts. To strangers it appeared as nothing more than another relic of New England's fading wealth, its gables heavy with moss, its windows sealed tight as though the house itself feared what might drift in from the world outside. But the locals knew better. They had watched the family for generations, a line of heirs who were born within its walls, who grew up under its roof and who disappeared into its shadows without ever leaving. No coffin ever passed its gates. No heir ever fled to seek fortune elsewhere. The estate seemed to absorb its bloodline, one by one, as though the walls were more than wood and mortar, as though they fed. The silence around the Griffins was not born of respect, but of fear. Neighbors whispered in taverns and at church steps about family loyalty, about strange traditions of inheritance that bound sons and daughters to their birthplace until death. Yet no one dared question why that death never seemed to happen in the open, why funerals were never held, and why the estate's iron gates remained rusted shut. There was a kind of uneasy bargain in the air. The house remained occupied and the town remained quiet. In return, the Griffins' misfortunes stayed within their land, unspilling into the wider community. Behind its facade, the house carried a darkness that pulsed with each generation. The walls seemed to tighten year by year, a suffocating closeness that left even visitors gasping. Some swore they heard faint knocks when passing its boundary at night, as if something within tapped against the walls in signals no one alive could decipher. Windows were dark, yet shadows sometimes crossed them. The house was not empty, yet it was never truly alive. Its history was a loop, repeating, binding the Griffins to a cycle no one spoke of aloud. Elias Griffin, the first patriarch, had once claimed the estate was built on ground that chose its keepers. To the outside world, this was dismissed as the vanity of a man obsessed with legacy. But within his family, his words became law, more binding than scripture. From the beginning, he instilled a doctrine that every heir must remain inside the ancestral house until death. At first, it sounded like a call to preserve tradition, to protect wealth and identity. Yet the longer it endured, the more it became a prison with invisible bars. The Griffins lived as if the world outside had already ended, their universe reduced to those rooms, those corridors, that choking air. There was an eerie normalcy to it, the kind that made the horror worse. Heirs smiled in family portraits, sat at long oak tables and read by candlelight as if life was ordinary. Servants came and went, though rarely spoke of what they witnessed. Each new child was raised under the same unyielding rule. You are born here, you live here, you die here. What might have been superstition hardened into truth, for no Griffin ever disobeyed it openly and none ever returned to contradict the silence. It was as if the house itself erased any trace of rebellion. What no one saw was how the house grew to mirror the mind that ruled it. Every window was narrowed to prevent escape. Staircases coiled in ways that left wanderers lost, and hidden doors were built into walls where no one expected them. The estate's architecture was less design and more strategy, as if drafted by someone who understood how confinement could wear down a soul more effectively than chains. The home was both sanctuary and snare, a cradle that became a coffin. Over time, the Griffins no longer saw the difference. Even the land surrounding the house betrayed an unnatural quality. Animals avoided its fields, paths disappeared into undergrowth as if nature itself recoiled. Travelers spoke of an air that thickened when they approached, of dizziness that came without warning. Some said the ground was salted long ago, mixed with things not meant for the earth, substances buried by Elias himself in his obsession with permanence. Whether myth or truth, the soil grew nothing but weeds that withered too quickly, like life rejected its roots. To the villagers, the house became a kind of unspoken curse. They called it the place that never emptied. Generations passed, and still there was always someone living there, though no one could remember seeing them grow old. The Griffins seemed frozen in time, their heirs aging behind closed doors but never beyond them. Birth records appeared, marriage certificates were filed, yet obituaries were absent. The paper trail confirmed lives, but never their endings. What survived was only rumor, and rumor sharpened into fear. And so the Griffin estate stood year after year, a place untouched by progress or ruin, feeding silently on the lineage that could not leave. The gates rusted deeper, the shutters hung lower, and the house itself seemed to breathe with quiet hunger. It was not only a dwelling, but a witness, a conspirator, perhaps even the architect of the fate it imposed. Those who passed its boundary could sense it. This was not a home where people lived, but a place where people were kept. And no matter how many generations rose within it, the Griffin house never emptied. Elias Griffin was not a man who appeared monstrous. To the outside world he seemed composed, a landowner of means, upright in posture and deliberate in speech. He wore black coats pressed without a crease and greeted churchmen with a polite bow. He gave to the parish when donations were requested and employed locals with fair wages when crops needed gathering. To many he seemed the model of discipline, the embodiment of New England restraint. Yet behind the estate's sealed doors his mind worked in patterns darker than superstition, and his sense of order was sharpened into cruelty disguised as tradition. 1821, Elias declared what he called the family law. A rule passed not by counsel or scripture, but by his will alone. No Griffin heir would ever leave the ancestral house until death. At first it sounded like little more than a father's wish to protect his children from the corruption of the outside world. He spoke of preserving bloodlines, of holding firm against a society he claimed was collapsing under greed and vice. His voice, calm and unwavering, made the decree sound almost sacred. Yet beneath the words was something colder, not the warmth of protection, but the satisfaction of control. For Elias understood something few others dared. Obedience becomes unbreakable when dressed in the clothing of faith. He began by teaching his children that the house itself was holy ground, chosen by providence. To step beyond its gates was to invite damnation not only upon oneself but upon the entire bloodline. He would wake them in the middle of the night, gathering them in the main hall by candlelight, their shadows stretching against the stone walls as he recited his doctrine. He told them that the soil beneath their feet carried the bones of those who came before, and to abandon it was to cut away one's own flesh. He bound guilt to geography, and slowly the children began to see the house not as a prison but as a body they were stitched into. But Elias was no fool. He knew belief alone could falter. Faith needed reinforcement, and he crafted methods of correction that blurred the line between discipline and ritual. When a child spoke of wanting to leave, he would isolate them in a chamber stripped of light, forcing them to sit in silence until they trembled at the sound of their own heartbeat. Hours would pass, sometimes days, until the child's resolve broke. He did not beat them in public or leave visible wounds. Instead, he left marks that no one could see. Fractures within the mind, fear that clung to every breath. His punishments were private, hidden beneath the surface, so that even servants suspected nothing. The family law was enforced in whispers and shadows, never in the open. Over time, what began as superstition hardened into generational prison. Elias cataloged every rule in his journals with the precision of a clerk. He documented the smallest details of defiance and its correction, recording the number of hours each child endured without food, the length of time they cried before silence returned. His notes were not filled with anger but with clinical satisfaction, as though he was measuring progress in an experiment. To him, his children were not simply heirs. They were subjects in his study of obedience. He seemed fascinated by how far the mind could bend before it broke, how loyalty could be manufactured through suffering disguised as duty. And he succeeded. The Griffin children grew into adults who never questioned why they remained. They learned to smile when neighbors asked about the estate, to speak politely of tradition without revealing the iron behind it. Some even convinced themselves of Elias's vision, repeating his words as though they had sprouted from their own lips. Loyalty had been rewired into them not through love but through methodical conditioning. What made Elias most dangerous was not his brutality but his appearance of innocence. He never raised his voice, never drew blood where it could be seen, never left evidence of cruelty that others could question. He cloaked his evil in structure and order in the appearance of a man preserving family values. To the world he was upright. Within his walls he was something else entirely, a creator of cages too subtle to be named. And with each passing year the rule grew heavier, as if the house itself had absorbed it, pressing down on every heir who entered. The patriarch's law did not end with him. When Elias finally died, his children buried him within the estate grounds exactly as he demanded, his coffin placed beneath the foundation stone of the house itself. It was said that during the burial the earth trembled faintly, though perhaps it was only the imagination of those who watched. Still, from that day forward, the law became more than Elias's command. It became the family's unbreakable inheritance, binding flesh to stone, silence to obedience, and every life to the house that never emptied. Elias Griffin's law did not end with confinement to the house. Containment was only the foundation. Obedience required deeper architecture, something that reached beyond the body and into the mind. His journals revealed the twisted philosophy he shaped in private, words written not with passion but with the calmness of calculation. He wrote of his desire to still the soul, to strip away restless will until nothing remained but silence and submission. To him, a restless child was not innocent. It was a flaw, a ripple in water that must be smoothed until the surface reflected only the image he wished to see. From this obsession came what the family later called the ritual of stillness. It began simply as punishment for disobedience, but under Elias's design it grew into something ritualistic, almost sacred. A disobedient child was led into a narrow room where the floor was covered in maize kernels, sharp as stone under bare knees. The child would be ordered to kneel without movement, their hands placed on their thighs, their eyes fixed forward. At first the pain was sharp, then burning, then unbearable, the kernels digging deeper until skin split and blood seeped through. Elias insisted they remain motionless no matter how their bodies screamed for release. The stillness was not punishment in itself. It was training, a shaping of the flesh to match his vision of silence. But Elias added a cruelty that made the suffering far more than physical. He required each child to speak aloud before the ritual began, confessing their defiance, their doubts, their sins as he called them. These words were recorded on crude devices he kept hidden, mechanisms of wax and needle, simple but effective. Once the child was placed on the kernels, Elias replayed their confessions back to them in a loop, their small voices filling the room again and again. Hours passed as their pain merged with the sound of their own guilt, until body and voice became indistinguishable sources of torment. They heard themselves accuse themselves, their young tones echoing with shame until they no longer trusted their own words. The ritual hollowed them from within, stripping away selfhood until only obedience seemed safe. What made this cruelty more sinister was how Elias cloaked it in normalcy. To outsiders, he spoke of discipline and faith, of teaching children to endure hardship so they might grow strong. He referenced biblical trials, claiming stillness was a way to prepare the soul for eternity. Yet behind closed doors, his methods were stripped of all mercy. There was no limit to the hours, no compassion when bodies collapsed. He wrote in his journals of how long each child endured before their sobbing broke into silence, how many days it took before they begged to be punished rather than disobey again. His tone was detached, as though recording weather patterns rather than the breaking of his own children. Over generations, the ritual of stillness became part of the Griffin inheritance. Children no longer questioned its existence. They feared it as inevitable, like storms or illness. They whispered of it in the halls at night, voices trembling, each one knowing that a single misstep could place them upon the kernels with their own voices turned into weapons against them. The terror was so effective that often obedience came before punishment was necessary. The threat itself was enough to keep them bound. Elias had succeeded in creating loyalty not from love or pride, but from the collapse of inner resistance. Yet the ritual had side effects that Elias never documented, or perhaps ignored. Many who endured it grew into adults with strange habits of silence, flinching at the sound of their own words, mistrusting their own voices as though they carried hidden traps. Some mutilated themselves in small ways, biting their tongues until they bled, as if to punish themselves before anyone else could. Others developed a frightening kind of calm, sitting motionless for hours by choice, their eyes empty as if they had learned to leave their bodies behind. What Elias called stillness had not created strength. It had manufactured ghosts inside living shells. The servants who witnessed fragments of the ritual carried their own scars. They heard the muffled cries through closed doors, the droning loops of recorded voices repeating sins too small to deserve such cruelty. Yet fear silenced them as well. Speaking out would mean punishment or dismissal, and dismissal meant exile without wages, a fate worse than death in a town where work was scarce. So they stayed, quiet, performing chores around the house while pretending not to hear. Complicity wrapped itself around the estate as tightly as Elias's law, making every hand a silent accomplice. Elias believed his ritual was permanent, a solution that would outlive him. In a way, he was correct. Long after his death, his descendants continued to kneel on kernels, continued to hear their own voices twisted into accusations, and continued to learn that stillness was the only safety. The ritual of stillness became less about Elias himself and more about the house, as though the walls demanded it, as though the estate fed on silence the way it once fed on loyalty. It was no longer questioned, no longer explained. It was simply the way things were, a tradition that marked the Griffins apart from the world outside. The horror of Elias Griffin was not only in what he did, but in how he made others carry it forward, how cruelty disguised as discipline hardened into inheritance. By the time the next generation rose, the ritual of stillness was no longer punishment. It was identity. To be a Griffin was to be still, to kneel, to hear your own voice condemn you until obedience was the only refuge left. And the house, with its closed shutters and endless silence, never let them forget. Beneath the Griffin estate, deeper than the cellars where wine once aged and grain was stored, Elias constructed a hidden room that was never meant for storage. The Chamber of Echoes, as it came to be known in whispers, was his most chilling creation, a place where architecture itself became a tool of punishment. It was not wide or tall, but narrow and claustrophobic, every wall lined with sheets of polished copper. The metal caught even the faintest sound and threw it back again, not as a clean reflection, but multiplied, bent, and sharpened into something unbearable. To step inside was to be swallowed by noise, a noise created not by the outside world but by oneself. Children who defied Elias's rule of silence were taken here. They were strapped to upright frames, their arms spread and legs bound so tightly that every twitch of muscle groaned against the restraints. The punishment was not the binding itself. It was the sound. At first, the child's breathing echoed faintly, a quickened rhythm that filled the chamber like a drum beat. Then came the cries, trembling at first, then louder as the confinement sank in. Every whimper returned magnified, not once but dozens of times, layers of sound folding upon themselves until the child's own voice became unbearable. They heard their pain multiplied into a storm until they no longer recognized it as their own. Elias designed it this way for a reason. In his journals, he described the voice as the enemy of order, the mouth as the gate through which rebellion escaped. To tame his heirs, he needed not only their stillness, but their silence. The Chamber of Echoes was his laboratory of silence, a place where the human voice was turned into a weapon against its owner. By forcing a child to listen to their own screams again and again, Elias broke the trust between thought and sound, leaving them wary of speaking at all. The copper walls gave the chamber an unnatural glow in candlelight, reflecting distorted shapes of the children's faces as they writhed in terror. Servants who were forced to clean the room described how the walls seemed to breathe after a punishment. Fogged with condensation, wet with the residue of crying and panic. Some swore they still heard faint noises long after the chamber was empty, as if echoes clung to the metal, refusing to die. To them, the room was alive, feeding on terror and keeping it stored like energy. Elias dismissed such talk, but he noted in his writings that echoes did seem to linger longer than they should, sometimes audible days after the punishment ended. He recorded this with fascination, as if it confirmed that the house itself had accepted his cruelty and made it permanent. What made the chamber most horrifying was the length of time the punishments lasted. Children were left for hours, sometimes days, strapped upright until their voices cracked and their screams dissolved into hoarse moans. But even silence was no relief, for the chamber repeated every faint sound, the scraping of teeth, the shaking of breath, the sob of exhaustion, until the smallest noise became unbearable. Many broke down completely, not from pain of the body, but from the realization that they could not escape themselves. Madness hollowed them, leaving them afraid not of Elias, but of their own existence. In later generations, the chamber became part of the family's inherited fear. Children grew terrified of the sound of their own voices, speaking less, whispering more, as if careful not to draw attention that might lead them below. Some became mute altogether, retreating into silence not because of choice but because of memory, the memory of sound used as punishment. To live in the Griffin house was to know that any word could be the beginning of a descent into copper walls that would never stop repeating it back. Elias, however, did not see cruelty. He saw order. His journals describe his satisfaction in hearing the silence that followed a punishment, a silence so heavy it seemed sacred to him. He wrote of children emerging from the chamber pale and trembling, their eyes vacant, their lips sealed tight as though words themselves had been burned from their mouths. To Elias, this was triumph. He had not punished rebellion, he had erased it, and to him erasure was the highest form of loyalty. Even after Elias's death, the chamber remained untouched. Later Griffins used it not always as punishment but as inheritance, showing children where obedience had been forged, reminding them of the price of disobedience. Some were forced to visit the chamber without punishment, told to stand within its walls and listen to the faint ghosts of past, screams embedded in the copper. Whether real or imagined, those echoes were enough to keep them bound. The chamber became less a room and more a presence, a reminder that silence was survival. The cellar above it smelled of earth and rot, but beneath the chamber of echoes thrived with an unnatural cleanliness, copper polished and frames wiped, as if the family feared neglecting it would weaken its power. It tended to be like a shrine, though no prayers were spoken there. Only terror, repeated endlessly, remained. By then the Griffin estate had become more than a home. It was a place of rituals that erased humanity under the mask of tradition. The ritual of stillness crushed the body into obedience, but the chamber of echoes hollowed the mind, reshaping thought itself until even the innocent act of speaking was drenched in fear. The heirs no longer needed Elias alive to control them. His inventions were enough. They carried his cruelty forward, not with rage but with precision, as though silence and pain were family heirlooms to be guarded. And the house, watching through its shuttered windows and echoing corridors, never released what it consumed. By the late 1800s, the Griffin law had hardened into something close to scripture. Each generation was raised under its weight, convinced that the estate was both cradle and coffin, and that to leave was to unmake oneself. Yet even the strongest chains can rattle, and in 1889 one heir dared to test them. Jonathan Griffin was 22 when he tried to escape. He was not reckless nor foolish. He had watched the house all his life, studied its rhythms, listened for the moments when watchful eyes turned away. To outsiders, Jonathan was quiet, obedient, a son who smiled politely at the church steps. But behind that practiced calm burned the unbearable hunger for freedom. He planned carefully, storing food in hidden places, marking the times when servants entered and left, calculating the distance from the gates to the village road. He imagined that if he reached it once, if he breathed air beyond the rusted boundary, something within him would finally break free. He carried in his heart the memory of the echoes and the stillness, punishments that had hollowed him but not destroyed him. He believed escape would prove that the rituals had failed, but he underestimated the family and, worse, the house itself. Jonathan was caught within hours, not by chance but by design. The estate had long been wired with invisible threads of control. Relatives whispered of secret watchers and hidden passages, doors that allowed one Griffin to observe another unseen. Jonathan's steps toward freedom were measured before he took them, and when he slipped beyond the main doors under cover of night, his absence was already known. He was dragged back through the gates before dawn, his face bloodied, his hope extinguished. The punishment that awaited him was not routine, it was not a ritual of discipline, it was a warning, meant to etch terror into the blood of every future heir. The patriarch of that time, Charles Griffin, a descendant of Elias, decided Jonathan's body would carry the lesson. He believed rebellion was a disease, and like any infection, it must be cut from the flesh and displayed, so others might learn. Jonathan was stripped of his clothes and bound to a table in the cellar where Elias's tools had been preserved like relics. Instead of whipping or confinement, Charles chose something more methodical, almost surgical. He carved away Jonathan's skin in patches, each one shaped into the family crest, the griffin bird with wings outstretched. Slowly, carefully, he worked, as though branding the body not with fire but with absence, cutting the emblem into living flesh. Jonathan screamed until his voice collapsed, but the sound only fueled Charles's steady hand. What made the punishment most horrifying was not the pain, but the purpose. Charles was not trying to kill Jonathan quickly. He was shaping him into a symbol, a grotesque canvas upon which the family's loyalty was engraved. Stripped of skin and emblems, Jonathan's body was submerged in a vat of saline brine prepared in advance. The salt preserved the wounds from rotting, kept him alive, and magnified every nerve's agony. His body floated upright, his eyes forced open, his skinless patches burning endlessly while the rest of him remained intact. Days passed like this, his life prolonged by careful feeding and forced hydration, each moment a reminder that escape was worse than captivity. Servants were ordered to witness him, to walk past the vat and see the heir who had broken the law. His raw flesh glistened beneath the brine, his face locked between horror and exhaustion, his eyes begging without words. Children of the family were brought down to see him too, told that this was what disobedience meant, that Jonathan was not their brother or cousin anymore, but a hollow vessel of warning. The message was not hidden. It was displayed day after day until obedience settled in their bones like marrow. Jonathan became less a person and more a relic of fear, preserved like the estate's wine, his suffering distilled into memory. Some said Jonathan begged for death, mouthing words through cracked lips, though his voice had long since collapsed into silence. Others claimed he fell into a trance, eyes blank, as if the mind had finally left the body behind. What remained was not truly alive, but not dead either. Charles kept him like this until his body finally failed, weeks after the punishment began. Even then, his corpse was not buried in the estate grounds. His remains were kept submerged, sealed in copper, a grotesque effigy hidden below for future generations to glimpse in moments of instruction. Jonathan Griffin never left the house, not in life, not in death. His escape ended with him trapped in the deepest chamber of the very place he sought to flee. The psychology of this cruelty was simple, but devastating. By turning rebellion into spectacle, Charles ensured no heir would attempt it again. The body itself became the warning, the evidence, the scripture. Where Elias had created silence through rituals, Charles enforced permanence through preservation. He blurred the line between punishment and science, transforming his kin into experiments whose only outcome was fear. His notebooks show detailed entries of Jonathan's decline. Body temperature, duration of survival, the degree of swelling in each patch of carved flesh. He wrote not with guilt but with fascination, as if studying the properties of the human body under stress, as though Jonathan was not family but specimen. From then on, no heir tried to leave. The house had claimed its victory not only through tradition but through terror embodied in a single ruined man. Generations whispered of Jonathan, not as a martyr but as a warning. He was the Griffin who tested the gates, and in doing so proved that the house never lost its grip. His fate lingered in the corridors, in the eyes of children who never dared step too close to the iron gates. The estate had found its cure for rebellion, preservation through fear, pain sculpted into loyalty, and the promise that escape was worse than captivity. And so the Griffin house never emptied, not because its heirs were faithful, but because the memory of Jonathan Griffin taught them that some prisons are not built of stone, but of blood and terror carved into the flesh of their own kin. The Griffin estate had always been a fortress of blood, but blood alone could not sustain lineage. Outsiders were occasionally drawn inside by marriage, women who believed they were entering a family of stature, a house of tradition. What they could not see until it was too late was that tradition in the Griffin home was a mask for cruelty, a set of rituals designed to strip newcomers of their will and fold them into silence. It was never a union of love, only an initiation of obedience. When Margaret Whitcomb arrived in 1902 as the bride of Edward Griffin, the house seemed to embrace her with false warmth. The halls were lit brighter than usual, candles arranged in rows to cast an almost celebratory glow. Servants smiled, though their eyes betrayed unease. Margaret was young, graceful, and hopeful, carrying with her the innocence of someone who thought marriage was an escape from her own family's poverty. She did not realize she was walking into a cage that tightened with every step. The Griffins had long held rituals for women who entered their line, practices they disguised as ceremonies of purity. Each bride was expected to prove her devotion to the house, to submit not only her name but her body to its rules. It was Elias's descendants who had codified this cruelty, refining it into events cloaked in the language of sacred duty. Margaret was told she would wear a gown crafted especially for her, a garment that symbolized endurance and loyalty. She was told it would be sewn upon her, to join her flesh with the fabric of the family. She accepted with nervous compliance, not suspecting the truth until the gown was revealed. It was no fabric at all, but an arrangement of thin wire threads interwoven with such delicate precision that at a glance it gleamed like silk. Each strand was sharpened, designed to cut only when pressure was applied. The gown shimmered in the candlelight, beautiful and grotesque, a trap disguised as finery. When Margaret stepped into it, the wires clung against her skin like cold breath. As the final stitches were bound, sealing the dress into place, she felt the first sting of pain. Every movement pressed metal deeper. Every breath widened the invisible wounds. The Griffins watched her with quiet satisfaction, their faces calm as if nothing unusual was happening. The ritual demanded that she wear the gown through the night, to prove her stillness, her devotion, her silence. Margaret tried to comply, holding herself rigid, but the body cannot remain a statue. Each tremor of muscle, each shiver of fear drew the threads deeper. Cuts opened along her ribs, her arms, her back. Blood traced invisible patterns across her body, hidden beneath the glitter of the wires. With each hour, the gown grew heavier, soaked in what it harvested from her. By morning, Margaret was pale and trembling, her skin torn in dozens of thin slices, her breath shallow. Yet the Griffins did not release her. They insisted the ritual continue until she had proven herself worthy. Her final hours were a slow drowning in her own body's exhaustion. The wires constricted as her muscles swelled from strain, biting deeper, slicing through skin until she could no longer move without agony. Her breaths grew weaker, each inhalation pressing sharp edges further inward. She collapsed before the family altar, blood soaking into the wooden floor beneath her. The Griffins stood in silence, watching her struggle, their faces composed as if witnessing not death but fulfillment of duty. When Margaret's body finally stilled, her eyes wide in disbelief, they declared her sacrifice complete. To the outside world, her death was presented as an accident. The gown was described as an heirloom garment, fragile and easily broken, a tragic relic that failed under its own weight. Neighbors whispered of bad fortune, of garments cursed with poor craftsmanship. The truth was buried within the walls, left unspoken by servants and family alike. Margaret was remembered not as a victim, but as another silent figure swallowed by the estate. What lingered most was not her death, but the psychology it revealed. The Griffins had perfected a cruelty that appeared ceremonial, a punishment disguised as purity. To them, Margaret's suffering was not sadism but tradition, proof that outsiders must bleed to be accepted. The gown was a symbol of devotion but also a cage. Once worn, it left no path to freedom. In their twisted logic, Margaret had not been destroyed. She had been joined permanently to the house, her silence woven into its legacy. Future brides feared the same fate, though the ritual was rarely spoken aloud. Some whispered of the gown still stored within the estate, cleaned and folded, wires sharpened again for the next arrival. Whether it was ever used again or left as a relic of terror, none could say. But its memory endured, a reminder that marriage into the Griffins was not entry into family, but initiation into torment. The house did not simply consume its own bloodline, It absorbed all who entered, reshaping them into symbols of obedience, silencing them in ways that could never be spoken of beyond its gates. Margaret's fate was both accident and design, both ritual and execution. In the Griffin estate, purity meant pain, devotion meant destruction, and the line between ceremony and cruelty had long ago disappeared. By the early 1900s, the Griffin family's inheritance had shifted from land and wealth to something far more corrosive. The rituals of stillness and echoes, the punishments that hollowed mind and body had done their work so thoroughly that silence itself became the true currency passed from parent to child. To be born into the Griffin estate was to inherit not freedom, not prosperity, but the burden of unspoken truth. They were raised in a house where words were treated as dangerous weapons, where speech was not expression but betrayal. In the Griffin lineage, silence was not weakness. It was survival. The family law had long forbidden heirs from leaving the estate, but by now the rules cut deeper. It was not enough to stay within the walls, they had to guard the secrets within them. Elias's journals, Charles's experiments, Margaret's wire thread gown, all of it was hidden behind the polite mask of tradition. But children by nature slip into confession. They speak too freely, whisper too much. The Griffins devised ways to prevent that weakness. They weaponized silence until even the thought of confession became deadly. Among the cruelest practices was the ritual of swallowing cloth. Each child, upon reaching a certain age, was brought before the family elders and handed a strip of linen dipped in black ink. They were told the ink represented the written history of the house, the secrets recorded on paper that must never be spoken aloud. To keep the house safe, they were ordered to consume it, to force silence into their own bodies. The cloth was thick, and swallowing it was agony. It stuck in throats, clogged airways, scraped lungs with fibers never meant for flesh. Some managed it, trembling and gagging until the cloth was forced down. Others suffocated, their small bodies thrashing as they choked on the family's secrets. Their deaths were not accidents in the Griffin's eyes, but proof of loyalty. Children who could not bear silence were not worthy to carry the family name. The survivors carried scars that were not visible, but lived in every breath. Many developed a lifelong fear of speaking, their throats aching with memory, their voices breaking when raised. They grew cautious with every word, calculating what might betray them, what might draw suspicion. Even in adulthood they spoke little, trained to treat silence as nourishment, words as poison. The house grew quieter with each generation, not because it was peaceful, but because fear had erased sound. The corridors filled with the weight of things unsaid, heavy enough to choke anyone who lingered. In journals hidden within the walls, descendants recorded the ritual not as cruelty but as duty. They believed swallowing silence was the only way to keep the family whole. They wrote that confessions weakened blood, that secrets were safer inside the body than in the air. Some claimed the ink seeping through their throats was sacred, a binding substance that stitched their voices shut. It was a delusion, but a delusion so well practiced that it felt like faith. To them, silence was not torment. It was proof of devotion, the highest form of loyalty. The servants, too, learned quickly. They saw the blackened lips of children who had forced down cloth, the vacant stares of those who barely survived the choking. They heard the sudden absence of chatter, the unnatural hush that followed each ritual. But like all who lived within the estate, they kept their observations buried. To speak was to invite suspicion, and suspicion could end in suffocation. Silence spread like a sickness, turning the estate into a place where voices no longer lived. Only the creak of the house and the sigh of the wind broke the quiet. Human sound had been trained out, erased, buried in ink and cloth. As the years passed, silence hardened into tradition. It became something heirs inherited with pride, though that pride was laced with terror. Families outside boasted of money or land. The Griffins boasted of restraint, of children who never cried, never shouted, never confessed. But beneath the surface, every silence was built on suffocation, on bodies sacrificed to keep secrets buried. Silence had become both a weapon and an altar, a ritual that demanded lives in exchange for obedience. The psychology of it was devastating. Children who survived the cloth often grew into adults who distrusted their own tongues. They feared the sound of their own voices, flinching when they spoke too quickly, swallowing words before they could escape. Some developed the strange habit of chewing scraps of paper, tearing books into strips and consuming them in private, as if repeating the ritual on themselves to avoid punishment. Others learned to write their thoughts but never speak them, filling journals with secrets that would one day rot in the walls. Words were exiled from the air, left to fester in silence. The Griffin estate by then was not a home but a mausoleum of sound. Each room carried the ghost of words unsaid, of children who choked, of truths buried inside throats. Silence was no longer absence. It was presence, heavy and suffocating, the truest heirloom of the family. And like all heirlooms, it was passed down carefully, guarded fiercely, never questioned. The house that never emptied now grew quieter than ever, as if the walls themselves demanded that no voice ever escape them again. By 1954, the Griffin estate stood in quiet ruin, its shutters sagging, its gardens wild, its corridors rotting with dust and memory. Most of the bloodline was gone, consumed by the house and its rituals, leaving behind only Thomas Griffin, the last surviving son. He was not a patriarch like Elias, nor a surgeon of cruelty like Charles, but something altogether different. Thomas did not simply enforce the rules of silence and stillness, he turned them into spectacle. He was a man who found beauty in dread, who believed fear was not just a tool but an art form. In his hands, cruelty became performance, a theater where suffering unfolded slowly, deliberately under his watchful eye. From childhood, Thomas had been fed the rituals of his ancestors. He had knelt on kernels until his knees bled, listened to his voice crumble into echoes, swallowed cloth until his throat closed in terror. Yet unlike the others, he did not emerge hollow. Instead, he began to admire the structure of cruelty, the patterns that repeated across generations. Where others were broken, he felt inspired. He wrote in journals not only about the punishments, but about their symmetry, their timing, their effect on the human mind when stretched across hours, days, even weeks. To Thomas, torment was not chaos. It was choreography. It was this obsession that led him to design his most infamous creation, the chamber where walls closed in. Hidden in the far wing of the house, behind doors sealed with rust, he built a room unlike any other. Its walls were not fixed but movable, constructed of thick panels of iron disguised as ordinary plaster. Mechanisms beneath the floor allowed the walls to shift inward with the slow inevitability of time itself. not in sudden movements, not in crushing force, but in increments so gradual they were almost imperceptible. A victim placed inside would first feel only the strangeness of confinement. Hours later, they would notice the room smaller, the air tighter. Days later, each breath would be drawn in panic as the space shrank toward nothingness. Thomas believed fear was most potent when stretched thin, when dread replaced pain as the chief torment. He would place his victims within the chamber and leave them there, returning only to observe their unraveling. At first they paced, testing the walls, shouting into the silence, but time changed them. As the walls crept closer, inch by inch, they began to ration their movements, terrified of wasting the shrinking space. Sleep became impossible, breath became shallow, and minds fractured under the pressure of waiting for the inevitable. The crushing was not physical at first. It was psychological. The knowledge that space was vanishing, that the world itself was folding in, destroyed them long before the walls touched skin. In his notes, Thomas described this as the geometry of despair. He measured how long it took before victims stopped shouting, when they began to speak to themselves, when they finally grew silent, conserving oxygen as if silence could save them. He noted the exact day when the first sobs turned into whispers and the moment when resignation overcame resistance. The chamber was not designed to kill quickly, but to perform death in slow motion, to stretch terror into a symphony. Neighbors wondered at the strange glow of the estate at night, for Thomas lit his chamber with a single bulb, watching shadows deform as the space shrank. Some said they heard faint cries carried on the wind, though muffled, distorted, as though the house itself was swallowing the sound. Those who worked within the estate avoided that wing entirely, refusing to open the doors even when ordered. The chamber became the forbidden heart of the house, a place where cruelty was staged like theater, where time itself became a weapon sharper than knives. Thomas saw himself not as a monster, but as a custodian of legacy. He believed he was perfecting what Elias had begun, turning law and ritual into art that could not be forgotten. To him, the chamber was proof that fear could be eternal if properly structured. The walls did not simply kill. They told a story, one that victims themselves completed with their dread. He wrote that no punishment was greater than anticipation, no terror deeper than waiting for the moment when survival could no longer fit within the space given. Those who perished in the chamber were not buried. Thomas left their remains within until the walls pressed bones together, until skeletons lay collapsed in the center, broken not only by steel but by weeks of despair. He documented each case with care, sketching the positions of the bodies, noting how they folded upon themselves in the final moment. To him, they were not victims. They were participants in a performance, each one proving his theory that the mind dies long before the body. By the end of his life, Thomas lived almost entirely within that wing of the house, surrounded by his invention, sleeping in the corridors outside it as though the chamber itself was his sanctuary. He no longer sought company or conversation, only the sound of his mechanisms tightening, the creak of walls shifting. The house was silent except for that sound, steady and patient, echoing through the decayed estate like a heartbeat. Servants fled, leaving him alone with his creation. For Thomas, it was enough. He had become both audience and director, watching cruelty unfold in endless rehearsal. When he finally died, the chamber remained sealed, its iron mechanisms locked in place. But those who dared enter later found the walls scarred with scratches, nails torn away in frantic attempts to resist. Bones lay where the space collapsed to nothing, mute testimony to the slowest form of death a human mind could endure. Thomas Griffin had succeeded in leaving a legacy, not of wealth, not of heirs, but of terror drawn out over time, a cruelty so methodical it felt less like punishment and more like eternity pressing inward. The Griffin house did not collapse when Thomas's heart stopped. Instead, it seemed to sigh, as though one final performance had ended. Yet the chamber remained, waiting, its walls poised to close again, patient as the silence that had defined the family for generations. In 1971, fire consumed the Griffin estate. It began in the East Wing, perhaps from neglect, perhaps from some spark that had waited years for air, and it spread fast through wood dry as bone. Flames chewed through walls that had held silence for more than a century, and by morning the house was reduced to a blackened skeleton. For the first time in generations, the gates were forced open not by heirs, but by firemen and investigators, outsiders who entered not as guests, but as witnesses. What they found beneath the ruins was not ash alone, but a record of horrors the house had tried to keep buried. The cellar walls, though scorched, had held. Beneath them were copper-lined barrels, sealed tight and arranged with care as if the dead had been stored like possessions. When the lids were pried open, investigators recoiled. Inside were preserved remains, bodies suspended in fluids that had kept them intact long after natural decay should have claimed them. Each barrel carried a label, names painted in careful script, identifying heirs who had never been seen outside the estate. The family line that neighbors assumed had dwindled quietly had in fact been captured, preserved, hidden away in copper silence. They had not left because they had never been allowed to. Some remains bore marks too precise to mistake. Flesh carved in patterns of crests, skin removed in patches that told of punishment masquerading as loyalty. Others showed scars across knees and thighs, evidence of long hours of stillness pressed against kernels, bone warped from forced positions of immobility. One body's throat was blackened, clogged with fibers that hinted at suffocation by cloth. These were not accidents of age or illness. They were testimonies carved into the flesh, proof of rituals passed down as inheritance. But the barrels were not the only discovery. Among the debris were journals, preserved in hidden alcoves the fire had spared. Their pages were stained and curling, yet legible enough to reveal diagrams and instructions. Some contained sketches of the Chamber of Echoes, its copper walls drawn with chilling precision. Others detailed cages that could fold inward, mechanical devices designed to press bodies slowly until bone shattered. One set of pages described experiments with sound, notes on how repeated echoes could break a mind, how the human voice could be turned into a weapon against itself. Another journal cataloged mixtures of chemicals, substances tested on flesh to see how long they could preserve the body while still allowing pain. The tone of the writing was what struck investigators most. There was no anger in the words, no ranting or frenzy. Each entry was methodical, as though written by scholars recording research. The cruelty was stripped of passion, reduced to data, diagrams, and outcomes. What might have been dismissed as rumor or folklore now lay in black ink, undeniable. The Griffin family had not simply lived in silence. They had perfected cruelty as if it were craft, hiding it behind the facade of tradition. The discoveries spread quickly through the town. Neighbors who had once whispered of odd traditions were confronted with evidence far darker than gossip had ever dared. The house that never emptied had been less a home than a laboratory, each generation adding to the archive of suffering. For years, silence had protected the Griffins. Now, silence was broken, but only by the voices of the dead, carried out of barrels, etched in journals, lingering in diagrams that spoke of torment with frightening clarity. The ruins of the house were cleared in the months that followed, yet the memory of what was uncovered could not be erased. The Griffin estate was no longer spoken of as cursed, but as calculated. Not haunted by spirits, but by methodical cruelty that had hidden in plain sight. The barrels and journals were removed under cover of night, stored in archives away from the public eye. But the ground where the house once stood remained tainted, a scar in the landscape, as if the soil itself had absorbed the screams that copper walls once reflected. For the first time, the world beyond the Griffin gates knew the truth. The family had kept its heirs not out of loyalty or superstition, but through terror so carefully structured that escape had been impossible. What the fire revealed was not only death, but design, a pattern of cruelty so disciplined that even flames struggled to erase it. The fire that revealed the Griffin family's secrets left the estate a hollow carcass, its bones charred black against the Massachusetts sky. What stood for centuries as a fortress of obedience was reduced to rubble, and the decision was swift. The ruins would not be preserved. The house that never emptied was demolished stone by stone until the ground was bare. Yet no demolition could erase the truth unearthed in the cellars. The barrels, the journals, the diagrams of cages and echoes all stood as evidence that silence and tradition had hidden evil more enduring than fire. Public outrage forced the state to confront what it had ignored for decades. Families across Massachusetts began to question old practices of confinement, stories of children kept from the outside world in the name of protection. Laws were revisited, policies rewritten to prevent heirs from being bound to estates as property. Officials spoke of the Griffins as a rare and isolated madness, a dark branch on an otherwise proud tree of history. But those who read the journals knew better. Madness was not the right word. What unfolded in the Griffin house was not chaos, not frenzy, but order sharpened into cruelty, discipline stripped of compassion. A memorial was erected on the land where the estate once stood. Simple stone markers listed the names found in copper barrels, giving the dead what they were denied in life, recognition. Visitors came to stand in silence, yet even in grief the air carried unease. Locals whispered that the curse had not died with the demolition. Survivors of the family line, those who had escaped notice or lived long enough to see the estate fall, still carried its weight. Some were said to wake in the night choking as if cloth clogged their throats. Others lived mute, unable to speak more than a few words, their voices stolen by rituals long past. The Griffin's silence had seeped into them and through them into their children. The legacy of the house was not only in the rituals that destroyed bodies, but in the way obedience disguised itself as virtue. Outsiders had once admired the Griffins for their loyalty to tradition, their refusal to abandon ancestral ground, their discipline and restraint. Yet beneath those qualities was wrought a structure so perfect no one dared question it. That was the most chilling lesson left behind. Evil does not always arrive with chaos and blood. Sometimes it thrives in patterns too precise, rules too unquestioned, order too complete. The Griffin estate is gone, but its story lingers as a warning. How many other houses hide cruelty behind silence? How many families guard traditions that are cages, rituals that break rather than protect? What the fire revealed was not just one family's curse, but a mirror held to the world. The house never emptied because obedience had no exit. And now, as the memory fades, the question remains. What do you think? Could this happen again?